Well, where does one begin? I'd like to pray. Father, there are people here tonight who need to know what's on your heart and how to discern where to fit. Will you help this poor boy explain what some of the things you've shown me, so that what appears to be difficult really becomes so much clearer. We pray in your name, Jesus. Amen. Yeah, I need your help to remember where on earth I am. Yeah. Well, when you think about it, there's some take-home lessons about discerning God's will, and I want to be just as simple as one can be to tell you that this poor boy learned some things along the way, and I hope they'll help you. Because God has a heart that's very clear, and He's not willing that any of us should perish. His heart is that everyone should come to repentance. And Peter had the wonderful chance on many different occasions to walk out and get lost. And Peter puts it about as clear as you can. So if that's God's heart, and you get to, at 8 months of age, to grow up and arrive in the country of what was then Northern Rhodesia, and you discover that your granddad got there in 1917, and that your dad was born there in 1924, and that you're the eldest, going to become the eldest of 7 SJs, and you look back at your family and you recognize, well, there's my dad when he was about 13 in the late 1930s. And then you find out your granddad was the senior missionary in Zambia at the time. And the first question you get asked when you're this high was, what are you going to do, boy, when you grow up? And the only thing I could ever think of answering to that question was, I want to be a doc like my dad. But then the corollary was, well, aren't you going to be a missionary doc like your dad? Wasn't quite so sure that the logic tree was quite as impeccable. 1965 came. My mom and dad gave me my 16th birthday card, and it's Proverbs 3, 4, 5. It says, commit your way to the Lord. Trust in Him. What will He do? Show you His paths. Ooh. I was 16 reading this, going off to Canada, going to live alone, meet a family I've never met before, do grade 13, go try to get into university, and I'd been in a school where there weren't any girl in sight for 500 yards. And then the miniskirts are up to here, and you're supposed to concentrate in school. The girls were kind of pretty in Guelph, Ontario. And I found myself wondering, how on earth getting into medical schools, just like you, brother. Like, I was 16, going to Canada, and arriving and filled out a computer dating form as a 17-year-old freshman in college. And the computer spat back at me, you're too young. Nobody wants to date anybody like that. Well, that's how a Northern Rhodesian fitted into Canada. Found myself praying, well, Lord, if medicine and missionary medicine are in my future, better at least figure out the question. If you want to discern God's will, well, if that's what you want of me, Lord, I better understand what missionary medicine looks like. One thing to see it as a 13-year-old, 12, 14, 15-year-old, but now I was 20, and I was in medical school, and this Baptist college in McMaster in Ontario had all of a sudden opened up a medical school in '69, and they were looking to produce generalists, and they were playing around with things like international electives. No one had ever heard of such things in 1971, but this school sort of said, well, go and do it. I went to my dean. I didn't have money for an airline ticket. The dean sat there, listened to me, and says, we deans have slush funds, pulls $400 out of his slush fund and says, here's the leftover money you need for your ticket to go to Angola. And my grandfather shows up on the leprosarium in Angola, where my dad's been for all of 6 months. First patient on the ward has been mauled by a lioness 3 days before I get there. Has been sliced practically as much as you can slice anybody from the top of the shoulder through the middle of the shoulder blade down to about your 9th rib. And left for dead in a village setting where she was only 12 miles from the hospital. Took them 12 hours to get those 12 miles. Well, I was blown away. Dad fixes such things, and you get to hunt the land too? I was really just blown away that there were opportunities like that. So, in 1971, with 2 sisters who were in nursing school at Rutgers, Sharon was in 3rd year and Sheila was in 2nd year, we set off from JFK to go and find out what this was all about. And I found out that I really love surgery. And the University of Toronto was looking for crazy ways to prove the people at McMaster University had never learned anything because we were doing problem-based learning, and I hadn't spent any time in an anatomy course doing all the traditional things you waste 2 years of medical school to do. And I'd gone to see patients from the first day I was in medical school. Found out that dextrocardia meant that you listened over here. And yeah, that was crazy stuff. But the next question was, I met a girl, and I had to figure out, was Peggy going to be part of my life? And if so, if she thought about being a bush girl, was she marrying me to live in Mississauga just outside of Toronto? Or was she coming to think that maybe following this crazy boy to Angola wasn't a terrible, crazy idea? Well, what did I find out? Her best friend had been born in Angola, and she had heard where the Angolan geography was before she ever met me. So Peggy married me in '73. We celebrated 50 years just this last year. And we go and have a honeymoon in Angola because Mom says, can't come to the wedding. Why don't you come here for a honeymoon? So we spent 6 weeks, 3 of them in Angola. You know what? A leprosy patient, Peggy's age, looking twice the age with lepromatous leprosy and all the leonine facies changes that ugly lepromatous leprosy does to us, comes out of the leprosaria of 350 patients, comes up to Peggy and says, do you know how to crochet? And this is a girl with no fingers from ulnar palsy, got stubs. She's doing crochet. She befriends Peggy in those 3 weeks we were in Angola. And I discover something. God's been working in her heart too. Because 2 years later, we're imploring God, and you know how when you implore God, you usually tell him what he should be doing. And we were telling God, hey, Dad's been in Angola for now 4.5 years, and he needs a furlough, and he needs a replacement. This 60-bed hospital where he's been working, this leprosaria, it clearly needs somebody to help carry the load. Well, I started looking at the list. Who's available to go? There's some old Angolan missionaries who got kicked out in the Portuguese era, and they're maybe able to go. Why don't you send them, Lord? And I had a long list of all the thems. And you know how it is, if you're starting to pray and you have a long list of all the thems, The end of the list comes, and what about you? Oh, well, I said to God, it's easy to volunteer for something you know you can't possibly fit into, because the Portuguese at the time required me to have a tropical medicine diploma. I didn't have one. They required you to have a grade 6 certificate in fluency in Portuguese. I didn't know 3 words in Portuguese beyond bom dia, boa tarde, and como está, and onde está o casa de banho. Very important. Where's the bathroom? So that happened. I saw my name at the bottom of the list. Stephen, why haven't you volunteered? I figured it was easy to volunteer for something you knew you were be kicked out of the room for. What I didn't know was my dad was having an interview with the Governor General of Angola the week that I volunteered. Governor General of Angola said all those rules don't apply anymore. If your son's willing to come here, he's welcome. So I figured my catch was I hadn't gone to speak to the director of the postgraduate training department. And I figured that guy's going to say, this doesn't work. Give you back. You're an R2 going on to R3, and you want to come back? This is University of Toronto. We're into stuff. We're not into this kind of international stuff. Come on. Back in this day. Well, I go to Owen Gray's office, sit down, explain. Owen Gray stands up, leans across the table, says, young man, this is the best idea anybody's come in here in a long time to talk about. When do you need to go? I said, what? You're approving? And so it was. On a Friday afternoon, I walk out of his office. He's given me 6 months off. Come back on January the 1st and you'll be in R3 in one of our city hospitals. I get to Angola on the 1st of July, 1975, thinking that independence in Angola was going to, well, like it was in '64 in Zambia. You fired a cannon, you traded flags, you had fun, you firecrackers, and you had a party. Independence had come. No one had told me that the Portuguese had become and had been, and probably still are, the world's #1 slavers on the universe. 1/3 of the slaves ever sold to the New World came out of Angola. Angola's southern Atlantic coast, perfect place to send people where the British Navy would never catch them. And so from 61 to 75, there had been this war to try to get rid of the Portuguese. And so when 75 came, 3 different groups, one's got backing of China, one's got backing of Russia, the other's got some secret backing from South Africa and the CIA. And guess what? We have world stage played in the backyard of Angola. Within 3 weeks of Mom and Dad saying goodbye, we discovered, my goodness, we've walked right into something that we hadn't planned. Peggy's 5 months pregnant. We get a letter from the American consul and State Department saying, get out of town, boys. 30th of September is the last plane out. 400,000 Portuguese have fled, and what are you still doing here? The International Office of AEF sends me a letter saying at the end of August, get out, Foster. I turned a Nelsonian blind eye to that letter because I said, clearly God sent me here, and I'm not leaving when there's patients who haven't got a doctor within a 400-kilometer radius of where I was. I'll send my wife because she's pregnant, and really walking through the bush of Angola is probably not good for your pregnancy. So Peggy went in the last plane out. I got arrested as being a Russian spy that night. Pistol put to my head. What are you doing here? Kind of wondered what I was still doing there. But an officer shows up at 5 o'clock in the morning and recognizes my Canadian passport. Doesn't look like a Russian, does he? And apologized. 2 hours later, getting a formal apology from the commanding officer. The next thing you know, we're walking through the military hospital, and the next thing you know, we're loading 200 liters of gasoline in a drum on the back of our Suburban, and the next thing you know, we're being provided for by guys who 6 hours ago thought I was a Russian spy. And we began to ask ourselves, what on earth, Lord? This is what your will's all about? You said go to Angola and take Dad's place, but not to walk into this kind of stuff? Dad comes back in early December 1975. Backdoor stuff we don't have time to talk about. I get out on a CIA plane, 2nd of December, baby's due 4th of December. I promised to get home for our baby's birth, our first baby, the morning I'm leaving. Senior Silva comes, puts his hand through the window of the door of my dear brother Paul's dad's pickup truck. Says, Steve, I want you to remember one thing when you get back to Canada. Fica saber. Remember, we're here, and we're going to be praying that you come back here. Whew. 2 years later, you've finished residency, written your exams, you've got all those things. The hospitals are calling and saying, we got room for a general surgeon like you. You could come and work here, and all those communists, they need to go to hell on a grease rail anyway, don't they? And that kind of stuff is being put down your throat, and you're remembering, but Silva is praying that you'll come back. So what do? Is it convenient? Is a communist regime going to give a visa? All the hospitals, mission hospitals, all 30 of them, except one, are destroyed. Lubango, where he'd spent 75, not a brick left on top of one another. And next thing I know, Silva's voice is saying, Stephen, we're praying. There's one place for you to go. It's called Kelukembi. It's Swiss. It's different language, different place than you had planned, but there's a place for you. You'll be the only surgeon for 1 million people. Guess what? You're going to have some fun. We had 2 girls by then. Got there in 1978. It'll be 46 years next week. And wow, did we have something to learn or what? God gave us 2 kids born at Kelukembi, very proud to call themselves Angolans. This little girl, Rachel, is our SIM administrator, and this boy is Nick Commonellis' son-in-law because he married Nick's eldest daughter. So my compadre is here tonight. And God's done some amazing things in teaching us that in a 200-bed hospital in the middle of nowhere and you're the only surgeon, you can learn a whole lot of things by giving work to all the people that you share your burden with. And if you want to avoid burnout, find a grade 4 nurse who can do 25,000 spinals and doesn't miss. You don't have to try to fix it. If she can't get the spinal, give the guy some ketamine. You'll get along a lot faster. And you get the fun of introducing what was then, this was gastroscopy in 1981. We didn't have video screens. You just looked down the lens and you figured it out. And then you make friends with very dear brothers and sisters. And in 1980-81, you discover that some of your leprosy patients and TB patients are coming from an Atlantic province that has difficult access, where leprosy and TB is just going through. And the provincial commissar's driver has got open TV, cavitary TV, and he's coughing blood in the commissar's face. And the only reason he'll let you go and do things amongst an unreached people's group is because he doesn't like getting TB from his driver. And when you remind him that he's been driving with this guy for 6 months in his Range Rover, he kind of figures, maybe I do better do something about it. So he becomes your friend and gives you permission to go to an abandoned tobacco ranch where you can start a work for Jesus and make people know who he is, and at the same time deal with some leprosy and TB problems. And then God brings Alfonso into your life, who becomes the head nurse with his wife, and they go there with their 3 kids, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85. Christmas of 85, Alfonso comes to you 3 days after Christmas, and Alfonso says to me, Steve, I've been preaching there for 3.5, 4 years now. I've been driving this road every month. Landmines, ambushes, what's that? That's just normal around here. We don't think that's a problem. I'll do this. I'll continue to do this. I shared Jesus at Christmas underneath a big thorn tree, and I tell people that Jesus just happens to be the Son of God who cared enough to come. And as God sent his Son, and hey, Christmas is we're celebrating his birth. And the old men of the village come to me and say, we ain't heard no story like that ever before. Nobody's ever loved us that much. What you're telling us doesn't make sense. In our human experience, no one has ever given that kind of dimension of care. He asks me over a cup of tea, Stephen, what more is necessary for them to understand Jesus' love? And this boy says, I don't know, Alfonso, maybe we just got to keep going on. So he leaves my house 11 o'clock the next morning. He hasn't get 88 clicks down the road with 11 people on board his Land Rover, and he gets into an ambush. RPG goes through the transmission of the 110 Land Rover. Thing skids to a halt. Small arms fire rakes the car. 4 people are killed immediately. The 5th lady catches a bullet through her mid-femur. She's telling me the story 3 o'clock in the afternoon as we're putting in an extension and cleaning up the compound fracture the AK-47 bullet has a nasty penchant of doing. Alfonso gets shrapnel from the RPG to his right leg, shattered tibia, can't run away. Sits on the door of the car through the window and remonstrates with the guerrilla leader who comes up to the side of the car to steal everything that's in the car. And Alfonso says, don't you read the sign on this car? Hospital de Calquembe? Don't you see this as an ambulance serving the people of Angola? What are you doing? Shooting up the car. The leader pulls his pistol out and shoots Alfonso in the head and kills him on the spot. I'm faced with the responsibility of telling his widow 3 days later, after we had buried him on the Tuesday afternoon with the 4 others who were killed. I've never been to a funeral like it. Several thousands of people, all asking God why there are 5 coffins in front of us. How are we going to negotiate these roads anymore? Alfonso's gone. What are we going to do about the clinic? His widow goes back to the clinic. Says, God called me. God called my husband. My husband's in glory. I'm waiting my turn too. I'm going back to the clinic. 6 months go by. The same old tribesman that had come and given her husband a hard time come and say, hey, we're beginning to think your husband was on that road with medicines for us, food for us, our salaries for the last month. He was taking those risks every month. He did that for 3 whole years. Well, you tell us about a God who sent us his son, And he died for us. Well, your husband died for us. Then he starts to drop. And today, there's a church amongst the Kuvali people because one man gave his life for them. And brothers and sisters, when I start wondering whether the last years in Angola have been of any value at all, there is one very simple person I know who's going to ask me some questions. Alfonso is going to tell me at age 35, I got translated into God's presence. You're at 74, and what are you still doing for the kingdom's business? Are you faithful, boy? What are we going to remonstrate? What are we going to talk about, sort of story-wise, over the kingdom's business? If it cost Alfonso his life to have the privilege of seeing a family grow of God's people into the kingdom, wow, the privileges we've had to develop ministry partners, to see medicine changing and breaking through where witchcraft has been the purveying influence for the last half millennia, where stuff starts to change and you go and you experiment with working in the city hospital and you find the Marxists have so indoctrinated people that you spend 5 years banging your head against the wall and then from 90 to 95 trying to get a postgraduate program going of training for generalist physicians, and it's a total loss, at least on the human level, looking at it from my point of view. But God hasn't forgotten his people. Well, the wars intensify. That's what I found in 2002. It was left the operating room I had been in 1975. The war came to the cities. It pockmarked every city we could measure. And then, in 1999, my dad, in his early 80s, goes up to a mountain church in North Carolina and says, God's called us to come back to Angola to build a hospital someday. Don't know when, don't know how. And a young man in the back says, how much would something like that cost, Dr. Foster? And Dad said $1 million would get us started. Guy asks for my dad's card. 3 days later, the phone rings. Can I come for tea? Well, my mother always served tea at 10 o'clock. So if you came to our house in North Carolina, in Greensboro, you'd get tea at 10. The gentleman sits down in the living room, says, Dr. Bob, you said you needed $1 million to get a hospital started. I became a tither. On Saturday afternoon, I sold $10 million worth of property. I owed God $1 million. You need it. Takes his checkbook out, writes a check for $1 million. And my dad calls me 10 minutes later, says, you won't guess, there's a man and just came into our coffee room and I had tea with us and he's just giving me a check for $1 million. And I said, Dad, you better get that down to the bank right now. That may be bouncing. No, it didn't. We went to Franklin with that money at Smyrn's Purse, and the Evangelical Medical Center 6 years later was open courtesy of that gift. So what I'm trying to tell you today is that if you take first and 1 and 2 and 3 little steps with God, who pays his bills? Our Father. And what does Jesus say? You have not because you didn't do what? You didn't ask. And what does also Jesus say? If you would just act like children, what do little 3- and 4-year-olds do when they climb on daddy's knee? They ask questions. When are we going for sherbet? When are we going to get a sucker? When are we going to get some chocolate? What about this? What about that? And what does Jesus say? If you scoundrels know how to treat your children and give them the best, are you giving them stones or snakes? No. how much more does my daddy love to honor you for asking? And so, brothers and sisters, the mystery of God's ways it starts in God's heart. He's told us what's on His agenda. The question is, what's on yours? Because, my goodness, if we're going to unpack health and hope through Christ, through this broken world, we better get serious with who's sending us to do His work. Because if we aren't reflecting the values of Jesus, and if they don't see the smile and the beauty of Jesus in our faces and in our hands, woe betide us as followers of Jesus. And so the privilege I've had of public proclamation, and each and every day, and praying with patience, and discovering that every once in a while, this boy runs out of the things his 10 fingers can do. And I've had countless patients now with terminal diagnoses of cancer that we sit and pray over, and God says, but Stephen, you haven't asked me. And God has chosen to tell this boy, you thought you were a surgeon, you could fix things, yeah, but you haven't asked me. And God has had great delight in healing some of those people, so that this boy who says, hey, you should be getting ready to call the undertaker or call your 3 friends who are carpenters and cut a few boards, I can postpone that because, hey, this kid's walking out of hospital. And I've had that privilege time and again. And so as God opens the door, and as God opens the door even through the Pan-African Academy of Christian Surgeons, on the 2nd of January this year, 2 residents have started general rural surgery in Lubango, courtesy of stuff that's serendipitously, quote unquote. God's mercy has allowed us to see His provision over these last 17 years at the Evangelical Medical Center in Lubango. And I've been privileged to see, we don't have time to tell you, new horizons with the Pan-African Academy. And in conclusion, my dad did some math. Grandpa had 58 years in Africa. He had 62. And I'm only getting around 52 and counting, depending on which time or which year you just sort of moving your, but from the time I graduated from medical school in 72. And guess what Paul says to the Corinthians? Why? These days are light and momentary afflictions. What they're doing is preparing for us to take this eternal weight of glory that's beyond all comparison. So what are you comparing things to, guys? We've got to get serious with the King's business and understand that His heart is broken for this world of ours, and He delights to show Himself to each and every one of us. And yes, it's a journey, and He doesn't tell you the whole story all at once. Alfonso did not know he was going to get translated into God's presence at age 35. But he clearly understood where he was going. And if you and I know where we're going, then what's holding us up taking this journey? And may we be found faithful as we move forward. Thanks, brother.